Welcome to the Built with Grace podcast, and thanks for joining us on our study, God Shows Up, a study on God's timing. God's timing is always perfect, but not always comfortable. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review and share this with your friends. This helps us get the word out to more people. Also, leave your email address if you would like information on upcoming study guides. Chapter 12 God Shows Up, even when we don't acknowledge His presence. God sighting. God shows up even when he seems absent. Ken Mattingly was an American astronaut scheduled to be the command module pilot for the Apollo 13 space mission to the moon in 1970. However, just days before the mission, Mattingly was exposed to measles. Because he'd never had measles as a child, he was considered a high risk to get the infectious disease. As a result, he was replaced on the space mission by fellow astronaut Jack Swigert. Needless to say, Mattingly was extremely disappointed to miss out on his chance to get to the moon. If you're familiar with the story, you know that just moments into the flight, an explosion damaged the spacecraft. Not only was the mission to the moon scrapped, but the 3 astronauts on board were in danger of being lost in space. One of the main issues in getting the spacecraft safely back to Earth was the lack of power due to the explosion. Engineers on the ground scrambled to find a solution but were unable to do so. Mattingly was called in to help with the problem. No one knew the Apollo 13 spacecraft better than he did. Mattingly climbed into a similar spacecraft and, after several attempts, found a solution that eventually saved the lives of his 3 comrades in space. He never got the measles, but that event gave him the opportunity to save the lives of his friends. If he had not been exposed to the measles, the story of Apollo 13 could have ended quite differently and tragically. Some call situations like that fate or karma. But as we've seen over and over and over again in our study on God's timing, we know that the Apollo 13 situation was a God sighting. Do God sightings occur among all people? Definitely. Do God sightings occur even when His presence isn't acknowledged? Every single day. Take, for example, the story of Jean. Jean was the mom of 2 young girls, one a toddler, the other an infant. Recently divorced, she got a job at a daycare. The pay wasn't great. The work was far from what she had a degree in. Yet every day she took her girls to work. Every day she got to see their struggles and victories. Every day when they needed a hug, Mom was there. As the older girl neared the time of beginning kindergarten, Jean was faced with a dilemma. She lived 30 miles from town where her daughter would start school in. Trying to figure out the physical and emotional dynamics of that situation kept her awake at night, until the phone call came. An acquaintance of hers called and offered her a job in the area of her expertise in the school her daughter would attend. Coincidence? I don't think so. Then there's the story of Jeff and Sally. Both newlyweds and graduates of a small local college, Jeff got a job 300 miles from where they lived. They found an apartment and set up home just a couple of miles from his new job. When he arrived for work the first day, his boss took him aside and gave him the news. The company has decided to move in a different direction, and Jeff would no longer be needed. He went home worried, confused, disappointed, and unemployed. 3 weeks later, a competitor of the first company called and offered him a job with better pay and better benefits. Karma? Nope. God sighting. Dan had promised his family he'd be home in time for his son's birthday party. Just as he was getting ready to leave, he got a very important call from a client. Much as he'd like to ignore the call, he took it. It lasted longer than he thought, and rather than leaving a few minutes early, he left a few minutes late. On the way home, he came upon an accident scene. The ambulance was just leaving the scene with lights and sirens. As he made his way past the scene, it suddenly dawned on him that if he had left as planned, he very well could have been in that accident. Luck? Nope. God sighting. The one thing all of these situations had in common is that there was no direct mention of God in their stories. You may have a story like that of your own about how events of your life seemed hopeless at the time, but later you could see how God's hand was working in every detail. Our sovereign God is always working in the background, whether we acknowledge his presence or not. Take the story of Esther, for example. Esther was a beautiful, talented, wise, and well-respected woman living in the Persian Empire. Her people, the Jews, were exiles under the rule of King Xerxes I. Esther's story is a bit of a Cinderella story. In spite of all the things Esther had in her favor, she lived in a culture where women were considered second-class citizens at best. The fact that she was a hated Jew made her even more of a marginalized person. Her rise to fame was an interesting story in and of itself. King Xerxes I threw a huge party to celebrate himself. This was no small party. It was 6 months long and full of drunkenness and immorality. Every official of the Persian Empire was invited. Feeling the effects of pride and alcohol, the king summoned his wife, the queen, to the banquet hall to show off her beauty. Most texts imply that the order was to dance naked before a bunch of drunken men. The queen, however, did not wish to be humiliated in that way and refused to come. The king's advisors implored him to act swiftly and harshly. If this woman were allowed to refuse a command of the king, all the women in the kingdom may feel they can say no to their husbands, and society would be ruined. The king agreed, and the queen was never heard from again. Much like the story of Cinderella, the king's men initiated a search throughout the kingdom for the replacement of the queen. The glass slipper they carried was a chance to become queen of the Persian Empire. Soon the king's harem was filled with the most beautiful and intelligent women of the kingdom. These women would go through strict training in all things of being a queen, physically and academically. Think of it as an intense 12-month spa treatment. The king's eunuch took a special liking to Esther. She was a woman of beauty that reached beyond the physical to the internal. A woman of grace, integrity, wisdom, and character. What the eunuch didn't know was that Esther was also one of the hated Jews that were living in the land as exiles. Every good story has a subplot, and the story of Esther is no exception. There's no mention of Esther's parents, but she was raised by her uncle Mordecai. Mordecai had a habit of hanging around the gates of the palace to keep an eye on things. One day he overheard a group of men plotting to kill the king. Mordecai tipped off the officials, and the attempted assassination was exposed, and the perpetrators were executed. One would think that Mordecai would be well liked and celebrated for his actions, but that was not the case. His actions went completely unnoticed by everyone except Haman, the king's closest advisor. Haman hated Mordecai with a passion. It was really all about pride. The king had decreed that out of respect, everyone was to bow down to Haman every time he passed by. Mordecai didn't see the need to comply. As a result, he became that constant thorn in Haman's side, like the little pebble in your shoe. Haman's hatred led him to devise a plan to kill Mordecai. When he found out Mordecai was a Jew, he expanded his plan to kill all Jewish people. He went before the king to report about a group of people, the Jews, who were different than everyone else. They worshiped different, they stayed to themselves, they were simply a menace to society and didn't fit in. Haman suggested that the king issue a decree that all Jews be exterminated. In return, he would personally donate a large amount of money into the king's coffers. Money talks. His plan worked. The king thought it was a good idea and issued the decree, not knowing it meant certain death for Queen Esther, who he dearly loved. Mordecai learned of the plot and got word to Esther about the danger she and her people were in. While it concerned Esther, she didn't see how she could do anything about it. No one, not even the queen, was allowed to approach the king unless they were summoned. Going in uninvited meant certain death. Mordecai challenged Esther to rethink her position by saying, "If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this?" Esther 4:14. Esther took Mordecai's words to heart and asked him and others to fast for 3 days. Then she would approach the king. Note she asked people to fast, but prayer was not mentioned. Esther devised a plan and approached the king. Haman's evil plan was exposed, and he was promptly executed on the very gallows he'd built for Mordecai. The Jews were not only saved, but became highly respected by the people in the kingdom. Esther's actions, risky as they were, saved an entire nation. The book of Esther is unique in the sense that God's name is never mentioned, even though his presence is obvious. His timing was perfect, but not comfortable. The story almost seems surreal, with so much happening in the background to protect God's people. You may not be called to save a nation or astronauts, but each of us has a story in which our sovereign God is working. So what can we learn from the story of Esther? God is working in your background. Whether he is acknowledged or not, God is working in the background of your story. This is true for those who claim he doesn't exist, as well as his most devoted followers. We've been talking about God sightings throughout this entire study, those times when God appears just when we need him the most. Sometimes those God sightings are difficult to see without looking closely. Sometimes they don't appear until after we take action. Esther was faced with a difficult choice. She was in a foreign land. She had no direct contact with anyone who could help her. There were no priests or prophets from whom she could get advice. While Esther acted on her gut instincts, she had no idea how things would work out. In retrospect, we know that the source of those gut instincts came directly from God. The second thing we can learn is that God often calls us to do the seemingly impossible. There is no logical reason that Esther's plan should work. Nothing had been done in the past that would give her an idea of what to do next. However, our sovereign God doesn't play by mankind's rules. Seas don't part so you can walk through on dry ground. Bushes don't erupt into flames and not be consumed. You can't walk through an intense fire and come out not smelling of smoke. You may be walking through uncharted territory. The task before you may feel overwhelming. You may see no logical way for things to work out in your favor. If that's true for you, congratulations! You are in the right place to see God act in an amazing and impossible ways. God will accomplish his will. A rather ominous lesson to be learned is that God's will is going to be accomplished. Mordecai challenged Esther with perhaps the most famous words of the entire story. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? God has a plan, and he chooses us as humans to carry out his plan. If we choose not to do as he calls, he'll work out the plan through others, but we may suffer the consequences. Not the consequences of losing our salvation or of God's rejection. He remains faithful, and his promises remain even when we are not faithful to him. However, we may risk the consequence of missing out on his blessings. Jesus gave his peace with God on the cross. But the peace of God comes from doing the things he calls us to do. Sometimes those little steps can lead to big results. The story is told of a man who died and went to heaven. St. Peter was showing him through his mansion, and they came to a room stacked to the ceiling with boxes. The man asked Peter, "What are the boxes for?" The reply, "These are all the blessings God had for you, but you didn't take the first step." Don't allow doubt, fear, or logic keep you from allowing God to work in your life. Lastly, God places us where we need to be when we need to be there. This is closely tied to the previous section. God places us where we need to be to do his will. You are reading or listening to this study for a reason. God has something to show you, something for you to accomplish for the kingdom. And on the global scene, that may go unnoticed, but in the lives of those around you, it may be a life changer. The Apostle Paul states in 1 Corinthians 2:9, that is what the scriptures mean when they say, "No eye has seen, nor ear has heard, and no mind has imagined what God has prepared for those who love Him. God has some amazing things planned for you. Remember, He shows up even when He seems absent. Thanks for listening to this edition of God Shows Up. I hope it's been an encouragement to you in your walk with Jesus. Please leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, as this will increase our listenership. And reach out to me by email if you have any questions or prayer requests. Thanks again for listening, and have a blessed day.